Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I'll talk about conquering yarn stash issues. I'll give you a tour of my studio space, and we'll take a little trip back in time with a dozen stockings knit in the 1860s. So let's get started. So I've been working on my 1940s sweater, the front of my 1940s sweater this week. It's the same sweater I've been working on for a while. There's nothing really new to discuss about this. But somebody asked in the comments a while back, a few weeks ago, if I would give a tour of my studio space. And my response at the time was, well, I did that when I moved into this space a little over a year ago. I did a video on how the room was set up, and things hadn't really changed other than it was a lot messier and it needed to be cleaned up. There was a chain of things that happened that caused me to do a bit of reorganization and rearranging and have a few epiphanies about how to improve some things in my room, things that I have struggled with since I moved into this room, but also things that I have struggled with repeatedly over the years in terms of like yarn management and yarn storage. I'm not a habitual yarn shopper. I don't love going out and shopping for yarn, but I've been knitting for 35 years, so yarn does accumulate. Earlier this year, in preparation for Finish It February, I was telling people who hadn't done this before how to go through their UFOs, their unfinished objects, and how to sort of see everything that you have, and then how to sort it out in terms of, yes, I want to finish this, I love it. No, I absolutely hate this. I'm either going to throw it, give it away, frog it, something, but this project ceases to exist from this point forward. And then you have this pile of ambiguity where you're not really sure how you feel about it. And so I was telling people how to go through that first step and then how to figure out what it is you're going to want to work on. And during that, I was telling you the story about the first time that I did that, which was back in 2016. And I had done a whole reorganization of my very cramped office. And with bags and boxes were accumulating on the floor. It was getting hard to move around, and they were accumulating because I didn't have room to store anything. And at that point, I'd been a knitter for 30 years, and I'd gotten rid of very little of any yarn. I might buy yarn for a project that I never started, or I might start the project and then decide I don't want to do this, but I have the yarn. All kinds of things could happen. I could buy something that I really liked, like see a yarn I thought was really beautiful, not knowing what I was going to make with it. Or maybe there was something else unusual about it, and I thought, this is my only chance to get this. And so I would buy it not knowing what I would do with it, and then it would sit in my stash. So in 2016, I went through this 30 years worth of accumulation and got rid of about half of it, the half that I absolutely knew I was never going to use. And that left me with enough room to store all of the stuff that was remaining. And a lot of it was stuff that, well, this has potential. I think anybody who crafts thinks that. They're like, oh, well, I got to keep that because I might be able to use that at some point in the future. And for me, the future never comes, or it rarely comes. The way that I figure out what kinds of projects I'm going to work on is I think of what I want to make or what would be interesting, or I see something that I think would be really interesting, or I want to solve a problem in some sort of knitting engineering way. And I work my way through what that project's going to be, what it's going to look like, and I figure all that out. And the very last thing I do is figure out, well, what kind of yarn am I going to use to make that? And the first thing I will do is go and see if I have anything in my stash that will suit that purpose. And if what I need is a solid color worsted weight yarn, I'm usually all set. If it has to be superwash, I'm not. If it needs to be a tonal yarn, it's not. If I need a sweater's worth, I'm all set. If it needs to be more than one skein, I probably will not be set because, I have sweater's worth of worsted weight wool, and then I'll have odd skeins here and there. So more often than not, I need to buy yarn for the project. And so all of my stash tends to just sit there over and over again. And I've always stored it visually so that I could see what I had, because I'm a very out of sight, out of mind person. As I was cleaning up my office, going through things in the past couple of weeks, I found, some yarn that I wasn't going to use, and I packed it up in bags, and I told my husband, oh, I got another couple of bags of yarn I want to get rid of. And he started laughing. He said, you're always taking bags of yarn out of the office, but I hardly ever see you bring yarn in. He's like, anytime you buy yarn, you use it. And I said, exactly. I think what happened was in 2016, I got rid of my no pile. This is the pile of yarn I know I will never use. And there was some yarn that I was pretty certain I would use, self-striping sock yarn, solid color worsted weight yarn, and the rest of it was stuff I thought, well, maybe I'll use it, maybe someday I'll need it. I don't know. And what has happened since then is pretty much all of that yarn is what's been leaving my office. Every year or so, as I go through my yarn, I'm getting rid of more and more of the yarn that was left after I got rid of half my yarn in 2016. So I have made some mistakes where I've bought yarn, not knowing what I was going to knit with it. And typically the reason that I did that in the past was because I saw something beautiful. I thought, this yarn is so beautiful, I have to have it. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it, and I would buy it and I would never figure out what to do with it. So I recognized that, and I stopped doing that as much as possible. But every so often I get caught. And usually it's because it's a fiber that I haven't seen before. And because I haven't seen it before, I act like there's no way I'll ever see this again. I better buy this now. I have to try to think of something, and maybe the color isn't right, but I better get it now. This happened to me years ago with some mink yarn. I was like, oh my God. And I picked out a skein that I didn't love, but it was like a tonal gray type of thing. And I use gray a lot, but I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I finally came up with a project that I didn't particularly like knitting. I never used. There were also times where I decided, oh, I want to deliberately work at knitting with other wool breeds than I have worked with before. And the first time I did that, it was Zwart Bliss yarn from an Irish Shepherd. I thought, I want to buy some of her yarn. I'm going to buy a sweater's quantity. I'm going to design myself an Aran sweater, and I'm going to knit it. And I did. But then what happened, I went to a shop that was going out of business, and I thought, oh, I'll go stock up on the stuff from her that I normally get from her, which is like solid color contrast sock yarns to use for heels and toes. That's usually what I would go to her shop for. So I got that yarn, I stood in line, I started looking at what was on display, because there's a long line because she was going out of business and everything was really discounted. And there I saw a display of some kind of yarn that was in a breed I hadn't knit before, and I thought, oh, this is what I'd been wanting to do, was knit with these other wool breeds. Well, how much should I get? What color? I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll just get like randomly one ball of each of these colors and figure something out later. Last year, I came across that yarn in my office and I got rid of it because I never came up with something to do with it. So it's that kind of a mistake that I'll make. What I could have done was take a picture of the label, because it was a commercially milled wool. This was not the only place to get it. And then I could have looked it up, gotten project ideas, thought about what I wanted, then figured out what colors I wanted, and then ordered it or found another shop locally that sold it. That's what I could have done, but it wasn't what I did do. So this is the kind of thing I'm trying to pay attention to, is what causes me to buy yarn impulsively. Because when I buy yarn impulsively, it either never gets used or it can take me 10 to 12 years before I will use it. And that just doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to do. Now, because the way I normally work a project is starting from my idea for the project and then working my way through until I get to the yarn, and I have a really hard time looking at yarn and then imagining it into something that I would actually want to knit and to use. What I'm doing is trying to target yarns that I actually do really like in my stash and move them to a location where I will see them on a regular basis and think about the fact that this yarn is something that I want to use and just have it constantly be on my mind. Because I am an out of sight, out of mind person, even though my stash is on display, I'm not looking at every skein every day and thinking about all the possibilities. That's too overwhelming for me to have that many choices all the time and try to think of it all the time. So what I'm really going to work at is paying attention to when I have an impulse to buy something that for some reason I think is scarce or I'll never see it again, and instead take a picture of the label, go home and think about it, figure out how I might want to use it, and then when I'm ready to buy that yarn and make that project, then I'll buy it. So I'm just trying to change some behaviors that have led to me storing yarn for years before I just ultimately get rid of it. What I'm going to do now is take you on a tour of what my current setup is, as well as point out where I've made changes to keep specific things in my line of sight so that I'll be reminded to use them. I'll also point out some things I've done to make accessing materials and equipment as fast and efficient as possible. You are not going to see a Pinterest-worthy tour of a fantasy craft room. I am absolutely a function over form person. There has to be logic and efficiency in how I work, and that's what my office is, the place where I work. My office is certainly more organized and a lot cleaner than it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, but it is still my work environment where I'm making a video in the middle of a work day. So you're going to see papers on my desk, a box of stuff here and there. But even if my desk were completely cleared off, my studio would not strike anyone as something that they'd want to see inside Architectural Digest. So as a comparison, allow me to show you a yarn room that was in Architectural Digest, which frankly looks like a complete nightmare to me. Notice the pasta maker they have standing in for a ball winder, which was presumably put in the photo because stainless steel is prettier to photograph than plastic. So let's go to the tour. This is the view that I have when I am sitting doing a Casual Friday. Over to my right is my audio recording equipment that is connected to my microphone so that you get better sound than having to use a microphone on the camera. There's the monitor that shows me what the camera is seeing. And this is the tripod that sits in front of me. I lower it and for when I'm seated during Casual Fridays, but I raise the tripod up higher because I stand when I'm doing the intros and outros for Technique Tuesdays. So when I do those intros and outros, I use teleprompting software. I script what I'm going to say so that I can say it quickly, concisely, and I don't forget anything. So when the teleprompting software is loaded into my iPad, it looks all backwards and upside down. So I can put it into this little stand here, and then I can see what I'm saying, and it will move as I'm speaking the words. It will advance the words as I go. So this is a mirror that reflects the teleprompter, and behind there is a little cloaking that will go over the camera, and the camera would actually sit right there. So up here I have lights. There's a pancake light there, and then there's a different type of light there, and that's what keeps everything well lit for whether it's my face or it's overhead. Now if I'm doing an overhead view, I have this device right here that I can hook my camera on so that it will point straight down. But if it's pointing straight down, first of all, I can't see anything behind the camera, but it also is recording upside down. And so what I have to do with my monitor is then adjust what the view is of the camera. It can switch everything upside down to right side up. So that's what's going on in my recording space. So let me move around and you can see where this is in context with everything else that you might normally see. There is some yarn storage, a lot of leftovers, samples, swatches, all kinds of things like that in this particular IKEA storage thing, my mannequin or dress form. And then here is what you normally see behind me, which is a lot of my books. And if I'm standing for a Technique Tuesday video, you'll see all of sort of some decorative things. Those skeins of yarns that are hanging aren't just storage and decoration. They also function to help with echo so that the sound quality is good and you don't hear a lot of echo in my recordings. So if I come back to my Casual Friday seat, then you can see I have some more storage over there in the corner, and there's my actual desk where I sit most of the day. I have a window to the right and then a huge set of windows to the front, and it can get very cold here in the winter, and sometimes I need a little extra heat. So if I come back around from where the camera would normally sit, you can see I have some storage here. I have a whiteboard where I kind of keep track of things. I have some blocking pads there and a steamer. So if I'm doing swatches, I can do a little bit of blocking right there. Let me just say my office is fairly clean right now compared to what it often is. It is not Instagram or Pinterest ready. You can see I've got coffee cups sitting there and some hand lotion and papers on my desk. So that's my life. The way I tend to organize is by zone. So my desk is sort of zone 0. I'm sitting at my desk most of the day. And so little tools and notions that I use constantly are on my desk or in my desk. I have 2 bins at the bottom. This one is for swatch yarn that I use for Technique Tuesdays. This one is for works in progress. So I keep all of the yarn for the current works in progress in there, as well as different parts. The sweater I'm currently knitting has a front, a back, and 2 sleeves. So I've got both sleeves and the back in there. I have a knee sock in there and the rest of the yarn to knit the second knee sock in there. So those are my current works in progress. And this just makes it super easy for me to reach whatever it is I'm most likely to be working on at any point during the day. So these 2 devices, or these 2 pieces of storage right here, are sort of zone 1. Like, I really do consider this zone 0. This is ground 0. And this is the next zone. I can reach a lot of this from my chair. These are notions that I use reasonably often, but not every day. So these are the books I would use most often. These are general reference books, and these with the spiral bounds on them. I had the spines taken off and had those put on there instead so they could lay flat on my desk. And then I have the Ann Budd books. These are sort of like basic design silhouettes that I can use as a starting point or as reference if I'm trying to get an idea of what is a typical proportion of something. And I have the rest of my stitch dictionaries as well, and reference books and design books are up here. Something new that I have just done in the past couple weeks is I have bins here for items that are in my queue. Like, these are the things I know I'm going to be knitting this year. In here is a sweater I've talked about several times on my channel. It's a sweater. I had a commercial sweater that I really loved, and the elbows blew out, and I decided to reverse engineer it. So I'm reverse engineering it with some modifications. So the original sweater is in there, and then I have the yarn in this bin. On the left, it's gray yarn and some red yarn. And then on the right is some navy yarn. That is the yarn I'm going to use for my 1970s vintage sweater, which I will design using an Elizabeth Zimmerman, her EPS, Elizabeth's Percentage System. And then in the smaller bin, I have the yarn and patterns for, well, one pattern for 2 hats I'm knitting, one for my brother, one for my husband. So these are things where I want to think about, this is what's coming up next, and I can see it from my chair constantly. What I've added to this concept is a bin down here. The green bin has some Icelandic yarn that I bought with the idea that I wanted to experiment working with this yarn and do something with color work, not knowing what that project would be. So I just bought a few colors that I thought would work well together. No idea what I'm going to make. And I want to look at this every day so that it will be on my mind and I will remember that this is something that I want to do. And then the box at the bottom is the yarn and some swatching for a project that I knit 8 years ago that I want to turn into a pattern. And every time I come across it, I think, oh, I love this little hat. I want to do this, and I haven't done it. So I've put it there to remind me to do it. If I don't use these things this year, my goal is to get rid of them. If I can't get the motivation to follow through with these things that I really want to do, then I'm not going to do them. And the only way I'm going to remember is if I have visual reminders. This over here is my circular needle storage. I love this so much. I cannot tell you how much I love this. This reflects exactly how easy things have to be for me to access and use. As soon as I decide I want a needle in a particular size, I can lean over from my chair and I can pull this over and I can see, oh, I want a size 3, and I look at what's in the size 3 area and I just pull one of them. Almost every needle is a 32-inch circular because that's what I use. I just modify my technique, magic loop, traveling loop, flat knitting, whatever. I want one needle. I don't want to have to search through my needles and figure out which one is the right length. It has to be easy for me. And this is something that I have just become more and more aware of, is exactly how easy things have to be. As soon as I know I want something, I need to know where it is. I need to get my hand on it immediately, and so that I can start using it in as little time as possible. I only have a couple of pieces of what I would call knitting equipment. Because mostly you have tools and notions in knitting. You don't have equipment that takes floor space or table space. But this is an exception. So I have a Swift up here, and I have a ball winder there, and I also have a scale. So these are things that I use very regularly. And so if I need the Swift and ball winder, I just stand up and I grab that, I set it up on my desk right in front of me, and I can use it within like 30 seconds. And to me, that is an ideal situation for any piece of equipment, that it takes less than a minute for me to get to it and get it ready. And I didn't realize how important this was to me until I moved into this office and struggled with my spinning equipment and sewing equipment and trying to figure out how to be able to access and set it up very quickly. So this is worsted weight wool. It's fairly close to my desk. It's the kind of yarn I use the most. Mostly when I'm knitting sweaters, I'm using a solid color worsted weight wool. And so I tend to accumulate it. I have far more than I really would like to have at this point. This is like worsted weight leftovers that are in natural colors, and so you can see this bin isn't that full, and it's very easy for me to tell what I have. I have some, dark like black, and I've got gray and white. So these are very easy to see, and that's because this isn't very full. What happened with my bin of colored wool is that it got completely full to the top, and I couldn't tell what I had in there. And so what I've done in here is I've created subcategories by color. So I have a bag of blue, a bag of green, and a bag of sort of blue-green. Apparently those are colors I use a lot. I have a bag of reds and a bag of purpley pinks and just a couple of balls of yellow. So I didn't put them in their own bags. So when a bin like this gets super full, I need to find a way to sort of file things vertically, so that I can use the entire depth of the drawer or the bin, but to make it super easy for me to grab what it is I'm looking for. This space right here is, this wooden parquet floor area is about 5 feet by 5 feet, which is about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. And you can see that it's sitting in front of this closet. This is a huge closet. The opening there is about 6 feet wide, so almost 2 meters. And then the wall that you kind of see going to the right, the closet continues in there for another couple of feet. In total, it's 8 feet long. This is the rest of my true yarn stash. The 3 on the top, and then on the next level, the one on the left and the one in the middle are all sock yarns, different weights. So I have them separated by weight, and then kind of the put up. So the one on the right at the top is like 50-gram balls, and then they have 100-gram balls on the middle, and then on the left, 150-gram 6-ply yarn. And I can have the same issue with the depth of these cubes that I have with the depth of a drawer. So this is a kind of a cube that if I have hanks that will fill in from back to front, I can stack things up that way, like I do with my worsted weight wool. But for things like this, where I could technically have a front layer and a back layer, I have learned not to do that because I won't be able to see it. And if I'm digging, then things fall out. The rest of the yarn is yarn in weights that I don't use very much. And a lot of it is likely to leave my stash over time, which is one of the reasons I decided to move some yarn over near my desk where I would see it every day. So back in here is where I have my fiber storage. I have some fleeces in there. I have a few tools. So I've got 3 pieces of equipment besides my spinning wheel, and that is the drum carder. And then on this cart right here, this little sewing cart, I have my serger. And then over on this table here, I have my new sewing machine. Originally, when I was setting up this room, I imagined that if I was using this table, I'd have to use this kind of 5 foot by 5 foot area, and it would block the closet or the bookcase. And so I thought, well, anytime I use a piece of equipment, I'm going to have to put the piece of equipment away when I'm done and then put the table away because it'll just be in the way otherwise. And therefore, I have to have storage space for all 3 pieces of equipment. I realized over time that actually the table can sit here and I can get to my door without any issue. And so it's not, and you can see the tripod is kind of in the way, but I can still walk through there without any problem. So this table doesn't have to be put away, and I realized I could actually have 1 piece of equipment out all the time. And therefore, I only need to store 2 pieces of equipment. So I have the drum carder on the shelf and my serger on the little sewing cart. But this was a real challenge for me, that I had a couple of challenges. When I thought I had to store all of the equipment, that drum carder had to be stored in its packing box on the floor where this little 3-drawer wicker cabinet is right now, which meant anytime I wanted to use it, I had to pull it out, unpack it, set it up, and then put it back in its box. And I cannot tolerate that. It takes too much time. Instead of doing that, I just wasn't using it. So I've learned a lot about that, like what I need in terms of things have to be easy. And the challenge is always, what is going to make something easy? That's the struggle I continue to face as I live in this office and use it on a daily basis. So I want to take you on a tour of a different type now. This is a tour of the past. So as you probably know, I've been working on a long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s. So it's 11 sweaters. I'm knitting my 8th one, but I won't be knitting one from the 1990s because I have plenty of examples of those currently in my closet. So I have 2 more sweaters left after the one I'm currently working on. And I've been thinking about, what do I want to do next? Because I'm absolutely an information seeker. I want to learn as much as I can about knitting. I'm very interested in knitting history, in understanding the techniques that were used that knitters used, and as well as in the instructions that they were given to knit particular things. So aside from sweaters, which is something I've knit since I started knitting in 1986, I really love knitting socks. So my two primary interests are sock knitting and sweater knitting. As I started this long-term project and I was reading sweater pattern after sweater pattern, I naturally got curious about sock patterns and how were sock patterns and stocking patterns different 100 years ago compared to how they are now, because sweater patterns were certainly different back then compared to how they are presented now in terms of even just the kinds of techniques and construction methods that are called for. So I started reading a lot of patterns, and I got really fascinated by what I was finding. And it began to occur to me that when I'm done with this long-term project of knitting sweaters, that maybe I will do socks and stockings. I've been collecting sock patterns from throughout the 20th century, as well as stocking patterns from the 19th century. First published English knitting pattern book was a booklet for stocking knitting that was published in order to teach children how to knit stockings. Certainly there were stocking patterns published before that, but not in a standalone book about knitting. They might be in a general household book that would include recipes and all kinds of things. And also, here's how to knit a stocking. A little bit before 1820 is when that first stocking pattern was produced. So it seems to me that maybe going through 200 years of socks and stockings could be an interesting thing to do. So a couple of months ago, I found out that there was going to be an auction for a dozen pairs of stockings that were knit in the 1860s. They had initials on them that indicated that they were all owned originally by the same person. I had a month warning on this auction, a month to think about this and to try to talk myself out of it. And I didn't talk myself out of it. I talked myself into participating in the online auction. My heart was pounding the entire time. I won the auction for the stockings, and I received them a few days later. It's so interesting to see a collection of stockings that were all knit for the same person, probably by the person who wore them. And to see the things that were very similar from stocking to stocking. It was also interesting to me to see things that she did slightly differently than what I had seen in any stocking pattern. Let's go to the overhead, and I will take you on a tour of the dozen stockings. So this is what the stockings look like. There is shaping here on the calf leg on every one of them. Every one of them has one of these little chain ties at the top. And every one of them has the same kind of the heel turn, I think, is the same. The edge of the heel flaps can vary, and then the toes are knit exactly the same. There are 3 decreases in every decrease round, 3 per round, and every round they're being decreased. So there's a stockinette heel flap, and then she uses the same turn. I'm not 100% sure what turn she used, but it could be either a Dutch heel or just a regular round heel turn. So on the edges of the heel flap, she's got garter stitch, and the way that she picked up stitches along this edge, you can see one of the legs of the stitches. So she picked up through the back leg of the chain stitch on the selvage, which is interesting. And she's got a short gusset here. They created what they called a seam line. Purl stitches were often called seam stitches because they were used down the back of stockings to create a ridge. So it might be garter stitch, it could be just purl stitches, but that helped them center the leg. And so when they were shaping increases and decreases around for the calf, that you could be sure to place them correctly. And if you used garter stitch or something like garter stitch, this is 2 stitches of garter stitch, that would be easy to count in between your shaping or for the total length. The things that she did the same every time were these ties, the heel, the stockinette flap, and the turn, but the edges of the stockinette flaps could vary. The toes were all the same, and she varied what she did down this line of seams. So the way that this stocking is different from others is this one has knit 2, purl 2 ribbing at the top. These appear to be cotton, they're not wool, and they're knit at a very fine gauge. So that's the first stocking. It's just a plain white stocking. Oh, and the other thing that she did each time was her initials are on here, MM, and then there's a number 2. My guess is that this is the second pair of stockings that she knit. I don't know if it's the second pair that she knit as a married woman. I don't know what if she ever was married or not, but since the initials are the same each time, I assume that these were all either she never married, she married someone with the same first initial, or these were all stockings that were knit for her after she married or before she married. This pair is very similar, but you'll see this one says 20. You see the same initials. This one has a different type of top to it. So you can see this nice little shell pattern. Again, we've got the chain at the top. Again, she has maybe a little bit of garter stitch, but not as many stitches along the side of this one. And again, that same toe that she had every time. There's this kind of marled red yarn. At the top, she's got this white section, and you can see for the cast-on edge, she used the marled yarn, and she used that for the edging as well. This is a pair number 30. For this one, she started the heel flap in the marled, and then for the heel turn is where she did the white, used the white yarn. And this one has the 2 or 3 stitches of garter at the edge. This is another pair, just like that. This one is knit to, purl to ribbing at the top, so is the first pair, but this one has got white along the edge rather than red. And again, the heel was done just like the other previous red one. This is pair number 31. So she did these 2 pairs in a row, and she did them identically. These stockings are fascinating to me because to me this tells me that the yarn was dyed so that it would create these little lines of white color, and that as the circumference of the stockings change, you can see that the way that the white bits interact with each other changes. You have little separations here, and then you have almost thin stripes here, and then when you get down to the foot, you get these kind of flashing bits of striping, which I find super interesting. Once again, we've got knit to, purl to ribbing, and look, we see that red and white marled yarn at the top, and with white here. And this is pair number 14. One of the things I've been forgetting to talk about is what she's doing along the seam stitch here. So in this case, she didn't use garter stitch, she used purl stitches, and those want to recede, so it looks more like a seam. You can see why they would call that seam stitch. She's got a, if we look on the inside, we can see that there are 2 columns of knits on the inside. She always used 2 stitches for her seam line. It was very common in patterns to only call for 1 stitch. So that was something that was really interesting to me, to see that she always used 2, which indicates to me that she always had an even number of stitches on the needles rather than having that 1 odd stitch that came down the back. This is pair number 21. This again has knit to, purl to ribbing. And this time we've got some stripes. We've got, and this is not self-striping yarn, she did these stripes herself. So these are red and white stripes. If we look at the heels, we can see that she carried the striping pattern down into the heel, and then she switched to just doing a white for the turn, and she's again got some garter stitch along the edges here. This is pair number 3. This yarn is different. It does not feel like a plant fiber at all. To me, I think this might be silk. It's got an interesting striping pattern here. Once again, she brings the stripes almost all the way down to the turn, and she's using garter stitch here, and she's got 2 stitches of garter going down for the seam line. And you can see that these have bled a little bit too when they have been washed. This is the same striping pattern that was used on the other 2, and this is the same type of yarn too that I think might be silk. This is pair number 38. Again, she's got garter stitch along the edges. And for the seam line, again, she's got 2 stitches of garter. These are really interesting. She's got a chevron. She's working on the bias here, so she's using a chevron pattern. So the top of the stocking is zigzag. This is pair number 33. Let's see what she's got going down the back of the leg. I'm actually not sure what she did for the shaping here. It almost looks like, well, there is shaping, but it's hard to tell what she actually did on this to shape the calf. This is pair number 19, and so this is a really cool striping pattern in here. And once again, she's got garter stitch along the edges of the flap. And she's got 2 stitches of garter coming down the back of the seam line. So knitters who always get upset about the jog and their stripes, you can see that this, you know, that happens. That was expected. That wasn't something that they tried to hide. They just accepted that that was what was happening. They placed it at a place that made sense, which would have been a seam line. And so at the top of these, again, she's got that really interesting sort of lace pattern here. Now that you've got some really cool socks, these are an entrelac pattern. And so she just starts with the squares at the top. She doesn't do anything like fill in a half triangle to make it go straight across. She's just taking advantage of that shape. There's no seam line here. She may have changed gauge because this looks a little tighter down here than it does up here. So she may have, and that may have been what she did in that other pair as well, was just use a little bit larger needles at the top in order to get that shaping. And once again, we've got garter stitch at the edge, but I love this little bit of striping along the heel here to it right up until the heel turn, and then she's got some striping before the toes begin to decrease. This pair does not have initials on it, so there may not have been a good place to do that on these that I could find, that I see. Yeah, she doesn't have her initials on these. So this is the last pair, again, entrelac, and similar but not identical to what she did. But again, it looks like these are bigger and she may have used a larger needle. I'd have to count the stitches and see if somehow she did some increases, but my guess is that she just used a different needle size. Now these do have her initials in these squares. So this says it's pair number 4, and she created a stripe along here in the heel as well as right before the toe. And this one has a tiny little hole in it here. So I hope you enjoyed this tour of stockings from the 19th century. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave those down in the comments below. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.